I've been in the idea that I'm working with one breath at a time has kind of technically, I still am, but, it's, as I've gotten into step 4 and used that as a way to explore different Dharma teachings, it can seem like we're not officially doing inventory. There's Eleanor came back. Um, but, I still view it as that, in a very kind of expansive way. Um, in any case, I've started looking at the 10 perfections, which I was talking about on Friday for the Spirit Rock class. And today we're going to take one up on one of the 10 perfections, which could take us more than one day. I don't think it'll take us 10 days to do one of the 10 perfections. That would be, I don't know what that would be. It would be like a flip. But anyway, the more I've gotten into looking at it over the last few days, the more I've thought there's a lot to explore here. And so I'm going to leave that as the teaser for, uh, for the class, so that people won't leave, uh, you know, before the commercial or during the commercial or whenever we have a teaser. I guess the meditation is the equivalent of the commercial in this analogy, and not a very good analogy, I have to admit. But let's begin. And as I say, I will practice mindful seeing. It doesn't seem that my earbuds are working properly today. Uh, I'm sure some failure on my own part. Earbuds are rarely at fault. Occasionally they are at fault. Um, However, that means that I'm using the microphone on my laptop, which means I think that other sounds might get picked up, like people walking overhead or me clicking on the admit button. So if you hear other sounds, please try to just be mindful of them and come back to the breath. So let's begin by establishing our meditation posture. How we hold our body is an important piece of meditation. Uh, we want to sit in a way that the chest is open so that the breath can come easily, that we can breathe deeply. We want to be sitting in a way that the mind can be bright and alert. So when I think of, how I used to sit in the classroom in ninth grade, it was the perfect way to not pay attention, slumped down, just in a completely like disinterested posture. So think of yourself as the good student in school who sits upright. And you can begin by closing your eyes, or you can just lower your gaze if you're more comfortable having your eyes still open a bit. And let's do a brief scan of the body to both relax the body and heighten awareness of sensation. So
Sorry, Lola.
I like to begin at the top of the body, at the head, relaxing the jaw, softening the eyes. Releasing the shoulders. and letting the attention scan down the arms to the hands. So this kind of scanning gives us more awareness of the aliveness of the body. We start to pick up the more subtle sensations, realize that the whole body is filled with sensations, some of them quite strong, others very subtle. And softening the belly, letting the breath move deeply into the belly. And then scanning down through the hips and pelvis, the legs and feet. And take a moment to just see if you can feel the whole body as a single object. The body alive, pulsing and tingling. Some areas feeling light, others heavy. Some areas very little or no sensation. Other places alive with energy. The body is one thing and many things, like a world within itself. Now opening to awareness of sound in this unique way of practicing together. Each of us is in a different environment, and so some may have lots of sounds in the background, others may be relatively silent. To the beginning meditator, sound is a distraction. To the experienced meditator, it is just another object of awareness. And in fact, often functions as a wake up, like a wake up bell, reminding us to come back to the breath. And noticing mood. How are you feeling right now? Maybe you like to meditate in order to get away from your feelings or to try to fix your feelings. But with mindfulness, the starting point is always what is true, what is here right now. can only transform if we first see the truth of what is. So opening to feeling, breathing with feeling, integrating feeling into awareness of body, into this broader awareness of mind. We tend to categorize emotions and moods as a kind of special type of experience. And while they do have some particularity, when we start to observe them objectively, we might see that they're not that different from the sensations of breath or the sensations in our hands. Just another felt experience, perhaps overvalued, overanalyzed. So just holding feelings in this broader field, this broader field of awareness. And finally, coming to the breath. For many of us, the breath is our meditative anchor, our home. Certainly not the only potential anchor or concentration object, but it's a traditional one and a convenient one. It's very simple, carries no strong impressions in terms of liking or disliking, being not extremely pleasant or unpleasant usually. So we can rest with the breath in a neutral fashion. To develop concentration using the breath, one approach is to feel very closely, intimately, the precise sensations of breathing in and breathing out. Start to explore these sensations with curiosity. Where is it easiest for you to feel the breath? Where does your mind come to rest most naturally? Typically, we point at the nostrils or the upper lip as a place to feel the breath, or the belly, the feeling, the rising and falling, the movement. Much of the time as we practice, concentration is fleeting. And so we keep bringing the attention back when we see the mind has wandered. Thoughts are not a problem for meditation unless we make them a problem. We can actually learn to be undisturbed by these movements of mind, so that rather than trying to suppress thoughts or turn them off, we change our relationship to them. We don't buy into every thought. We don't believe every thought. We don't measure our progress as a meditator by how many thoughts are coming. We simply let them come and go as we incline the mind towards the breath, towards the felt experience, moment by moment. All right. Okay. Um, so what I'm going to talk about today um, is this element of the 10 perfections called renunciation. And once again, I'll just list the 10 perfections because we'll explore a variety of these. We won't go deeply into every one of them, but over the coming weeks. So the 10 perfections are generosity, morality, renunciation, wisdom, energy, patience, truthfulness, determination, loving kindness, and equanimity. And it is said that the Buddha perfected these qualities, paramitas is the Pali term, that he perfected them over many lifetimes. So that's kind of why they're seen as perfections. And I put them because I think it's interesting and uh, also kind of there's some sort of wild stories that we can get into. There's one particular sutta I want to get into today. Um, so this principle of renunciation is an ancient principle, and it's one we find in all religions. But the Buddha clearly took it to extremes in his practice before his awakening, and this is an important part of his story that he went to such extremes that he almost killed himself with ascetic practices by starving himself, uh, and then realized that that was too extreme, and then tried to bring it back to a more balanced way of living, and this became known as the middle way. um, I guess a little bit more about that. So the Buddha was following these ideas that were out there at the time, and again are still sort of in the air in some ways, that if you renounce all worldly things, that somehow that will create a spiritual transformation. That there's even this idea that somehow the soul or the spirit is trapped inside the body, and so that if you weaken the body enough, that will allow the spirit to come out. Just kind of a mystical and dare say delusional idea. Um, but this is kind of what he was following. And and the stories in the suttas are harrowing, uh, where he's starves himself to the point that they say he's eating 1 grain of rice a day, and he gets so skinny that if he touches his navel, he he encounters his spine. uh, and there are statues you can see of the Buddha. The starved Buddha was just his ribs. Uh, and there were other ascetic practices, not wearing only rags and only taking, um, eating like discarded food, kind of eating garbage, living by charnel grounds where the bodies that were uh, where families didn't have enough to pay for the appropriate um, cremation, the bodies would just be disposed there, and then the vultures would come and tear them apart, and the people would go and meditate there. That's actually still a practice. So, so just to kind of finish this part of the story of the Buddha, that um, what's transforming for him is that he realizes that it isn't this physical renunciation, but that it's a mental renunciation that has to happen. And as I say, that's what we'll dig into more, and probably not even today, um, maybe a little bit today. But then that's when he decides he needs to take a certain amount of food, and and regains enough strength to meditate again, because it's really hard to meditate when you're starving to death and your hair is falling out. And uh, one of the other practices he did was he tried to not breathe, which didn't go well at all. He tried to stop breathing, and there's something in the suttas that says, like, he would hear this sound, like this roaring sound in his ears, which probably is what happens to you when you stop breathing. Um, so eventually, right, he kind of regains his strength, and realizes that all his efforting, and he realizes that not only his efforting in ascetic practices, but also his efforting in meditation was also getting in the way, and that there was actually a way to meditate that would be relatively pleasant, and that wasn't a problem. You know, and this is another kind of critical thing, because he got to this point where he was afraid of any pleasure, but he realized that mental pleasure through meditation was actually wholesome, that it was a positive form of pleasure, that it would actually support his growth, which is good to hear, right? Like, meditating isn't just supposed to be a miserable thing, that it's actually meant to be a pleasant. I can remember Wes Nisker, one of my teachers and good friends, years ago. He had a class in Berkeley for many years, and that was actually where I started to teach, when he invited me to start to fill in for him. But back in the mid-90s, I can remember him saying at one time, and he sort of disclaims this, but I remember him saying, "If you're not enjoying meditating, you're doing it wrong." I was like, whoa, that's really kind of, because of course people can take that wrong. Oh, I must be doing it wrong because I'm so miserable. But the idea is, don't make it miserable for yourself. And what do you like? Check out, what are you doing that's making it miserable for yourself? Uh, so he has this breakthrough, and just to kind of finish this story, he then, after his awakening, he goes back to find the people he'd been practicing with, doing the ascetic practices with. And they were these people who became some of his first followers, became his first monks. And they had stopped, they had kind of, left him when he started to eat, because they thought he had given up on the path, that he had gone soft. And he goes back and explains to them this middle way, that actually these ascetic practices that take you to the doorway of death are not useful, that they are, he uses the term ignoble, not noble. And he says the same is true of overindulgence in pleasures. That's ignoble. But that there is, I have found this middle way. Now, the middle way, according to the Buddha, is still pretty renunciant for a modern American, I would say. But we can get into that a bit. But let me just, bring this over um, to recovery, because recovery is a renunciation practice. It starts with renunciation, and for most of it's renouncing a substance. For some of us, it's renouncing a behavior, uh, or a way of relating with people. It'd be like for somebody who's an Al-Anon or Coda. But it always is about letting go of something, and which we can call renunciation. And so I want to go to this book that I talked about on Friday as well, by Sylvia Boorstein, called Pay Attention, for Goodness Sake. Sylvia is one of the founders of Spirit Rock, and this charming and delightful teacher who's really incredibly wise, even as she it kind of it seems to be sort of light in her teaching. You know, there's a lot of depth to it. And this book is a book about the 10 paramitas. And as I showed people the other day, she has a chart in the book where it kind of shows this. I'll read it to you, don't worry, but I'm just showing you that it's like laid out in this very sort of organized way. And the heading on the chart is refining the qualities of the heart. And then she has these columns are labeled the practice of, which is the names the paramita, develops the habit of, tells you what it develops the habit of, by, and then this talks about kind of the process by which that happens, and is supported by, and manifests as. So there's these 5 columns. So renunciation develops the habit of restraining, right? So when you get into letting go, then you start to learn to restrain, which is something we learn in recovery as well, that, oh, if you give up booze or drugs or, gambling or whatever it is, you discover that, oh, it's actually helpful to do this around other things. And she says, we develop the habit of restraining by realizing that insatiable wanting is suffering. So that's what recovery is. That's why we get into recovery. We realize that our insatiable wanting was not getting us anywhere. It wasn't solving our problem. It was, in fact, making it worse. And so she puts in parentheses the second noble truth. So the beginning of this process of renunciation and restraint comes about by realizing the second noble truth, that that greed leads to suffering, or that craving is the cause of suffering. So the practice of renunciation develops the habit of restraining by realizing that insatiable wanting is suffering, and is supported by discovering that everything passes, including uncomfortable desires. So that's insight into impermanence. So again, this connects very much for us with recovery, right? We realize, oh, like I really wanted that cigarette, but I just didn't pick it up. And then 5 minutes later, I forgot about it. I had that craving to drink, but when I didn't drink, that craving went away. I mean, I remember distinctly the feeling that I needed a drink, that I had to have a drink, and that if I didn't drink, something unimaginable was going to happen. So it kind of felt like I was going to die, which is, of course, ridiculous. But feelings aren't facts, but we tend to believe them like they are facts. So realizing impermanence really helps us to ride the waves of craving. And so the practice of renunciation manifests as temperance. Nice word thrown in there. If you recall the temperance movement, which was the early movement to ban alcohol, right? Which led to prohibition, which did not go well. So that's the kind of basis of renunciation. That's a nice kind of way of thinking about it. It's about realizing the second noble truth. That's what it's really about. We don't do renunciation to try to be good people, or follow the rules. The purpose of renunciation is to find freedom, to find happiness, because we realize that our clinging is causing suffering. So this is gonna be my fun part of the morning. I want to talk about some of the more extreme versions of renunciation that were practiced at the time of the Buddha. And this is one of the nuttier suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya, Majjhima 57. The name of the sutta is The Dog Duty Ascetic. So, well, I'll just read a little bit of it. So this is the way the sutras, most of them start, thus have I heard. So thus have I heard is like Ananda, the Buddha's attendant, reciting what he heard. Thus have I heard, on one occasion, the Blessed One was living in the Kolian country at a town of the Kolians named Halidavasana. Now, I read that part just to let you know, people who have not encountered the suttas at all, to see that these suttas often begin by being told where the Buddha was when he gave the teaching, and then we'll find out who was there. So it's kind of a way of giving credibility to this teaching. It's not just something like, oh yeah, this is the Buddha said this. It's like, no, I was there. I was there that day. He was in the in the Kolian country, and he was in this town there. And so here we get into the sutta. Then Punya, son of the Kolians, an ox-duty ascetic, and also Senya, a naked-duty ascetic, went to the Blessed One. Punya, the ox-duty ascetic, paid homage to the Blessed One and sat down at one side. It's the way you pay homage and you sit down at one side. Apparently it's like rude to sit like right in front of the Buddha. So you're always sitting to a side. Well, Senya, the naked dog duty ascetic, is naked, and well, you'll find out what a dog duty is. Exchanged greetings with the Blessed One, and when this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he too sat down at one side, curled up like a dog. Punya, the ox duty ascetic, said to the Blessed One, "Venerable sir, this Senya is a naked dog duty ascetic who does what is hard to do. He eats his food when it is thrown to the ground. He has long taken up and practiced that dog duty. What will be his destination? What will be his future course?" So the question he's asking is, if you act like a dog during your life, then how will you be reborn? Because they're doing this because they think that it's got some spiritual value, right? I mean, I don't know if I can think of any modern day equivalent to this. There probably is something that maybe one of you can come up with something, but it turns out like these people he's naked, he lives naked and crawls around like a dog and probably barks a lot and just only eats food off the ground. And you're like, what, really? You think this is gonna well, and this is the ox duty ascetic, right? Who's asking this question? Like, this guy's weird. Like the ox duty ascetic, of course, is trying to live like an ox, and apparently he like wears horns and goes, okay, then. So this is interesting. The Buddha doesn't want to answer this question. He says, what will be his destination? What will be his future course? Enough, Punya. Let that be. Do not ask me that. And so Punya insists on asking. So there are different ways the Buddha will answer questions. Some questions he will not answer. Some he says there isn't a good answer. Sometimes he remains silent, and then sometimes he gives an answer. But the classic thing happens here, which is that the person asks the question 3 times. They keep demanding, and finally, the Buddha says, well, Punya, since I certainly cannot persuade you when I say enough, let that be, do not ask me that, I shall therefore answer you. Here, Punya, someone develops the dog duty fully and uninterruptedly, living like a dog just all the time. He develops the dog habit fully and uninterruptedly. Having done so, on the dissolution of the body after death, he reappears in the company of dogs. Shock. Whew, man, didn't see that one coming. But if he has such a view as this, by this virtue or observance or asceticism or holy life, I shall become a great God or some lesser God, that is wrong view in this case. Now, there are 2 destinations for one with wrong view. I say 1, hell or the animal realm. I say hell or the animal realm. So Punya, if his dog duty succeeds, it will lead him to the company of dogs. If it fails, it will lead him to hell. It doesn't sound good at all, right? So So, guess what? Senia wants to know what's going to happen to Punya, and guess what? He's going to end up with oxen. So, the difference being the wrong view. Like, you wind up in hell if you have wrong view. That is, if you think you're going to get become a god, then that you're really off track and you're going to go to hell. But if you're thinking you're doing it like more as like a letting go, or you have some sort of good impulse, like I really want to, awaken, then maybe, you just wind up being a dog. So just to point out that this is just, this is the type of thing that people did with asceticism, that the Buddha's going no, you're just missing the whole point, right? That there is a point in trying to be humble. There's a point in trying to let go, or in renunciation, but it's not, to act like a dog. So there's a more refined element, teaching in here, which is very interesting. The Buddha says, there are 4 kinds of action proclaimed by me after realizing for myself with direct knowledge. There is dark action with dark result. There is bright action with bright result. There is dark and bright action with dark and bright result. There is action that is neither dark nor bright with neither dark nor bright result. Action that leads to the destruction of action. Now, this is kind of a typically somewhat opaque teaching, but it turns out to be quite, I think, quite useful in a way. So dark action with dark result, we can sort of imagine what that is.
Be right back.
It's okay. We'll mute you, whoever you are. Bless you. So dark action with dark result is like, killing, harming others, and he says, people who are really, their minds are really deranged with destructive habits. So a being who lives like that, being touched by afflictive contact, winds up in hell, as in the case of the beings in hell. So then bright action with bright results is like somebody who lives very skillfully and follows precepts, and generous, kind of follows all these kind of higher qualities like perfections, and they wind up being reborn in with the gods of refulgent glory. Refulgent, there's a word you don't see every day, but you kind of get the feeling of what it means. I've never looked it up, but refulgent, it's like these gods that are just like full of just light and happiness, joy. So that's so you got the dark action that winds up in hell, you got the bright action that winds up in a heaven realm, and then the dark and bright action. Guess where you turn up if you have dark and bright action? Human. That's the human realm, right? That's us. Is it's a mixture, and Bhikkhu Bodhi makes a note that it's not that you do those dark and bright action at the same time, it's that you do some of each, right? So that's us. So, but the last one, this is the one that's actually enlightenment, that's neither dark nor bright. So it's like not creating karma is what it is. So this is the principle that, enlightenment comes when we stop creating karma, and karma is created by thoughts, words, and deeds that are driven by intention, that are, driven by intentions for wanting, for not wanting. So, it's a beautiful, it, turns out to be a very rich sutta after you get through the crazy dog duty and ox duty people. And the good news is, both those guys, one of them, the ox duty guy, becomes a lay follower, the dog duty guy becomes a monk and becomes enlightened. So, it's always possible, even if you start off being a dog duty ascetic. There you go. um, I just remember that when I first encountered that sutta going, what the hell? dog, dog duty ascetic. But, so I want to talk further about asceticism as it's now practiced in the Buddhist tradition, and particularly in the monastic tradition. Because, as I said, what's considered a middle way by the Buddha seems to be a pretty austere way of living. We know that Buddhist monks are celibate, that they don't eat food after noon each day. They don't carry money. In the Theravada tradition, at least, so there's a lot that they renounce. They don't live with their family anymore. But so that I think we as people in recovery maybe can understand this kind of renunciation better than just an ordinary person who hasn't experienced the great rewards of letting go that we've had through getting clean and sober, through coming into recovery, that we recognize that so much of what is portrayed as the path to happiness and fulfillment in our culture is really empty. But I want to talk about what are considered acceptable ascetic practices in the Theravada today, and this is particularly coming from the Thai forest tradition, and the Thai forest tradition is really the one that I kind of know the most in terms of how the monks live, and the Thai forest tradition really kind of came alive in the late 19th century. And one of the things about Buddhist history is that there have been kind of these periods when the monastics become somewhat corrupted, or they become kind of urbanized and start to just live, with around the powers and the royalty, and they stop really meditating or trying to practice like the Buddha taught. And then there's what often comes out of that, and these are things that happen over usually a period of a few generations, is that there's sort of a rebellion or a wish to get back to a more pure form of practice, and monks will start to really study the suttas to understand how to live like a Buddha, and then they will try to really live like that. And so in the late 19th century, this started to happen in Thailand and other areas of Southeast Asia, where the monks started to go out into the forest and try to live like the Buddha said, to just live under a tree. And they would just wander from village to village and get alms, and then they would just practice, do their practice alone or in very small groups. And eventually, some of them became kind of renowned, particularly Ajahn Chah, and then the lay people would beg them, please stay with us and we'll build you a monastery. And so that's what happened with Ajahn Chah and some others. But they tried, even in those monasteries, to maintain the essence of what they saw as this way of living like the Buddha lived. And it's very beautiful in my mind that they had this motivation to not just like meditate or study the suttas, but to try to, like, how did the Buddha live? And it seems like the way he lived his daily life had something to do with his awakening and with what he was teaching. So they took on this simple forest life, even in the monasteries, and indeed today, even in Northern California, where we have a Bayagiri monastery, if you go there, the monks try to follow these, and you see like, oh, they've got laptop computers and they've got cell phones, and there's a lot of accoutrements of modern life, and people bring them food, and it's not that tough. At least it doesn't look that tough. It's too tough for me. So, but it's not like quite like the Buddha lived, but there's still this integrity to it that you see when you're there. But what they are allowed, there's a range though of practices that they're allowed to do. Uh, and this is called Dutanga. I'll type this into the chat. Oops, that didn't work. Yeah, I better put the pressure there. The Dutanga practices, there are 13 Dutanga practices. And some of them are sort of somewhat esoteric, but I know there are monks today who follow these, and oftentimes monks will follow them for a certain number of years. I know Ajahn Amaro said that he practiced this way for several years, but then he found that he was over striving. But I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to mention a few of them. One is that they only eat once a day, whereas they're allowed to eat between sunrise and noon, basically. And so typically at the monasteries, they have a little breakfast, and then they have a work period, and then they have their big meal at like 11. So for Dutanga, you just eat once a day. You have everything in one bowl, which most of the monks do that in the Thai forest monks that I've seen, which I can tell you, it can get pretty disgusting. When you put salad in there with the like pad thai, and then there's some fruit, and maybe, well, the candy bars they leave them wrapped, but it just starts to like turn into this mush. I mean, it's not that big a deal, but it's not something I would want to do. But the one that's really interesting is they don't, they never lie down. And I sat a weekend retreat years ago with Venerable Tampula Sayadaw, and they said at that time that he had not laid down for 27 years. So in the beginning, they will tie themselves to a tree or to a post when they want to sleep, because they don't want to like slump over and wind up lying down. But after a while, they get so good at it that they're just able to sit. They just meditate, they just sleep. There's sleeping, and then there's meditating, and then there's sleep meditating, which most of us do. So these are like the extra practices, and I'd like to, so the way I want to wrap this up today is to say what this is about. This gets associated, particularly raised Catholic, and there was this idea of penance, and we see these things, that silly book and movie, the Dan Brown thing, where the guy's whipping himself, and you know what I'm talking about, the Da Vinci Code. So raised in that culture, I always saw like renunciation and as a kind of penance, and it was like, oh, you've sinned, so by whipping yourself, or maybe more simply saying a prayer asking God to forgive you, then that sin is removed, so somehow your karma is repaired. But that's not the point of Dutanga practices or renunciation practice. The point of renunciation practice is to develop equanimity in the face of whatever arises. So what this means is that I'm trying to, through my meditation practice, get to a point where I'm not disturbed by stuff, where I'm not getting really angry. I'm not getting really aversive. I'm not falling into, craving that leads to, binging. And through my practice, I just through meditating, I'm actually practicing that. Meditation is a form of renunciation. I am renouncing the world for right now. And as I sit, I don't act on anything that arises in my mind. So that's a practice of non-reactivity, and it's actually a form of renunciation. I am renouncing acting on my thoughts and feelings for this 20 minutes, right? So as we do that, we develop this capacity within ourselves to be non-reactive. And so as you get into that and you get more into it and get more serious about it, you say, I want to raise the bar a little bit. I want to become more unreactive, if you will. And so I'm going to challenge myself by only eating before noon. I'm going to challenge myself by not acting out sexually in any way, celibacy. I'm going to challenge myself by not ever having money, by being dependent on others to take care of me. All these things, the point of them all is to develop this capacity to be equanimous, to be okay with whatever arises. Ajahn Amaro tells a story about one time he went to India, and he, I guess he was traveling alone. He lands in New Delhi, and someone has arranged a hotel room for him. And he goes to the hotel, and someone is supposed to meet him, and so that they can bring him food, and that they're going to travel. Obviously he's not going to stay in New Delhi. He gets there, and apparently there's some mix-up, and the person doesn't show up. So he just fasted for 24 hours until somebody showed up, and he talks about it, not about, like, it doesn't sound like he was that upset. I mean, I'm sure it was unpleasant, right, and difficult, but it's not like he was freaking out, like, oh shit, I've got to go grab some food. I got to call room service, because, he's not allowed to call room service. He could have walked out in the streets of New Delhi with his bowl, but, it's questionable whether he'd might come back without a bowl rather than coming back with any food. In any case, this is what it's about. And I think it's really, really important to understand that these practices are not about any kind of penance or, cleaning up our karma or anything about that. It's about developing this undisturbed and undisturbable mind. So I think that's a good place to stop for today. And we'll start to talk more about the inner form of renunciation on Friday. So thank you all for coming today. And just, I would recommend start to watch the things that you just act on impulsively, that you act when you act out of craving impulsively, and just see what happens if you don't act in that moment. It doesn't mean you can't have lunch, but it's like, what happens if I wait 5 minutes before I eat? What happens if I sit with this feeling of hunger for 5 minutes, or whatever the craving is? So, I rarely offer teaching, like practice teachings, but there you go. There's something. My gift to you today. Be well. And I'll see you guys in a few days. Bye.
Thanks.